Neoprog? Neo? And prog? No, thank you. Now, any British person will know that I am parodying, is that the word? Parodying a comedic routine by the great British comedian Peter Kay. I don't know how well known Peter Kay is. I imagine that anyone from any other country will not know who Peter Kay is and probably would not understand the humour, because the humour is really rooted in a sort of British and particularly English experience and worldview. So this sketch, Peter Kay starts to satire the average English person's attitude to foreign food, which then sort of compounds to the average English person's attitude to foreign anything, where he asks this imaginary English person if they like foreign food, and of course their reaction is almost like disbelief that it's even been questioned, you know. And then the guy looks down on the menu or whatever, this imagined idea, and he sees the words garlic bread, to which he says, garlic bread? Garlic? And bread? And the idea that those two things should never go together. I love garlic bread. There's those of us who love garlic bread and those of us who don't. Because what it personifies is one idea being mixed with, when I say idea, it's not the word, one sort of cultural entity mixing with another cultural entity. You know, most people who are racists, they tend to be racist because they have a very strong disgust urge. You know, some of us have a weak disgust urge, some of us have a strong disgust urge. You know, children become very aware of things being disgusting at a certain age in their development, you know, and if the bogey has touched the cup, it doesn't matter how much you wash the cup, the child will not drink out of that cup. It's been cursed by the very presence of the bogey in history. And when these people grow up, the idea of other cultures coming into theirs, they find quite abhorrent on a gut level. And this is one of the reasons why I think that modern identity politics is a great challenge to racism, because that is visceral, right? It's visceral, and all it will ever do is drive it underground. That's what it'll ever do. This isn't a social construct thing. It's not like that. We have a biological dislike of otherness, and the only way to beat that is to have lots of the otherness around you. To have lots of garlic bread, which I love. I love garlic bread. Do you love garlic bread? Right. So it's absolutely strange that there was a style of music called Neoprog in the 1980s. Right, now I've just filmed my video on the legacy of jazz, and I've got my Art Ensemble of Chicago, there it is, album there, and the proggers who are watching this, they don't know who the Art Ensemble of Chicago. So I need to put up something, I forgot, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out this one here. Should we do that one there? Oh no, I won't do that one. Let's think. I'm going to do this one. This one is a very expensive and rare IQ box set called the Archive Collective, and I'll put that up on there. Now, why have I got that album? I tell you why, because I'm on that album. I played drums on some of the tracks on that album, right? And so this makes this video even stranger, right? Because not only am I going to try and discuss this strange musical anomaly, which is Neoprog, right? Two concepts that could never go together in the 1980s, neo being newness and prog in the middle of the 1980s. You know, when Neoprog emerged in the 1980s, of all the styles that were emerging, it was the least neo of any style going. Art of Noise was neo. Do you know what I'm saying? Cabaret Voltaire, they were neo. Right? 12th Night weren't. This is bizarre. I find the whole thing absolutely bizarre. So that's the first thing. Second thing, I've got a stake in the game. I played with IQ. You know, I played in that band, and they are one of the sort of classic Neoprog bands. The Neoprog bands being IQ, Palace, 12th Night, Pendragon, and Marillion. All right? So this is really bizarre. Now this music emerges, and it's a sort of 1980s take on Genesis after punk had emerged. It's just, sometimes you can wake up in the night and go, did I dream that Neoprog? Was that a dream? Oh no, it's real. God, I dreamed that there was this guy called Fish, and he looked like Peter Gabriel. He was on top of the pops at #1. Is that true? Did that really happen? Oh yeah, that really happened. But how did it happen? I don't know. It's an anomaly. I don't know. So the whole thing's an anomaly, isn't it? You know, and the biggest anomaly is Marillion, right, coming out and becoming, perhaps here in the UK, bigger than any of the original prog bands. I mean, you know, Marillion became a stadium level band whose singles were going to #1. They were going into the top 10. Even Pink Floyd and Genesis and King Crimson, and yes, they had some minor hit records, but you know, their thing was albums, you know, but they never had that type of effect, you know, in the early 70s. And these are bands that sold millions and millions. Marillion just came and took over, and for quite a while, you know, they had a huge fan base. And then these bands, these prog bands, neo-prog bands, once their star starts to diminish, unlike any other band from the 80s, they then just go into obscurity and playing around, you know, shopping centres. Because so many of them being prog musicians, and prog musicians had gone from sort of, you know, beardy, weirdy drug takers in the early 70s to now we've got people who basically have worried about a second job, and so have, you know, they've done some training in IT. Okay? A fellow progger joked with me the other few months ago when Porcupine Tree were playing Wembley Arena. They went, oh my God, there's 12,000 Porcupine Tree fans in Wembley Arena right now. What happens if there's an IT emergency in the UK? Right? This is the bizarre thing, that the nature of what prog musicians were by the 1980s had changed. And once these people grew up, you know, they got into their property development. Basically what I'm saying, this was the music of the sort of upward middle class, you know, the educated elite, you know, and people who'd really cut their teeth in the burgeoning IT world. So when the internet came along, they were able to create structures, and Marillion really should go down in history for creating the Kickstarter idea, which is how we're all living now. This is how the music world works, you know. I earn my living partly now through Patreon. And Patreon is like a Kickstarter. People are funding me to do what I do before I do it. And thank you, patrons, for watching. I love you all, and I absolutely love my Patreon. It's so much better than the music industry was. It's a cozy place where I can go, be creative, bang stuff in, be surrounded by people that want to support me with money and are quite accepting to just go along with whatever I'm doing. It's a wonderful place, and I try and pay them back as much as I possibly can. Right, but that idea is rooted in not just Marillion, because my old band IQ, you know, once they got out of their major deal, or got chucked out of their major deal in the end of the 1980s, they set up their own record label, Giant Electric P, which I am currently signed to as I speak. And they have been able to keep their band alive since 1991. That's over 30 years, you know, by having their own label, that controlling their own accounts, their own releases. This is something that Neoprog brings to the world, right? So what exactly is Neoprog? You know, Neoprog bands came out bizarrely from the punk movement. So the punk movement opened up a sort of underground sort of gigging circuits in the UK in the late 70s. Small venues, do it yourself, people could form a punk band and they could go down to the local pub and get a gig. And out of that grew an alternative sort of homemade scene, you know, record labels like Stiff records emerged, but these had really started off as like sort of what were called independent record labels. You know, you would press up 100 singles, do the artwork yourself, do the post yourself, go out and do the gig and try and sell them out the back of your car at the end of the gig. And in that place, I think there was a freedom with punk where musicians suddenly went, well, what can we do? This is why punk didn't last that long, because once punk had allowed people to do whatever they wanted to do, we then get Joy Division, and we get The Cure, and we get like XTC, and we get like Cardiacs, we get all manner of bands which have got nothing to do with the stripped down minimalism of punk. And there's a load of people, a load of post-punks walking around that actually love Genesis, and they love Pink Floyd, and they love Yes. And they started to play on that circuit, and the dejected, prog rock audience that weren't being catered for because the so clever, critical elite in the NME was saying that prog was terrible, could secretly go down to their IQ gig and go to, into the marquee, and they could get a big dose of prog, and prog right in front of them, and they could get to know these people. And the people that got to know these bands in the early 80s stuck by them. When I was playing with IQ, there was people coming to the gigs that had been going to the gigs since 1981. It was absolutely incredible. What the Neoprog bands did was they sounded prog. This wasn't like Aisha or Yes's take on sort of commercialization of prog. These bands made sidelong epics. They made songs about wizards and chessboards and ravens and jesters and all that prog imagery. They used all of that. They almost like challenged the industry at the time by being so anti what the 1980s represented. Right? It seemed to come out at out of the shadow of the new wave of British heavy metal. And the new wave of British heavy metal by 82 when Neoprog was getting going, bands like Iron Maiden, and Diamond Head had also assimilated progressive rock influences. It was as though the worst characteristics of progressive rock, the pretentiousness, the immaturity of writing songs about Lord of the Rings, all that type of stuff that people say, the long solos, the sort of impenetrable lyrics, all that stuff had suddenly been squeezed. It had gone from being the mainstream of sort of clever kids that were at private school. It was now in the hands of these kids who'd grown up listening to progressive rock bands but knew it was a dirty word, and it had to crop out in the new wave of British heavy metal and in Neoprog, two forms which were not liked by the cool people, right? It's cool to like Iron Maiden now. It's still not cool to like Neoprog. I don't think we will ever live in an era where Neoprog will be seen as cool, But Iron Maiden, after like 40 years, and now being, you can see trendy girls walking around with their Iron Maiden t-shirts on. They don't know what they're messing with at all. Back in the old days, if you were an Iron Maiden fan, you were the uncoolest person on the planet, and you knew it, and you revelled in it. You didn't want anything to do with these Boy Georges and Duran Durans. You're an Iron Maiden fan, and I think that thing was in Neoprog as well. The music itself, very, very proggy. If we look at the bands that are out there, I think that Marillion and IQ really had their sort of influence coming from Genesis, but if you take something like IQ had a doominess and darkness that was much more appropriate to sort of the indie music scene, like bands like The Cure. That was in there as well. The whimsy that Genesis had, the whimsy is there in with IQ, and there's a sort of Monty Python-esque humour that exists around the band but not in the music itself. It's a really interesting thing, but IQ are dark. That's the difference. And with IQ, their subject matter is a lot more about modern relationships then, and certain modern cultural things. This is what made Neoprog different, and it might have been why in some respect there was a commerciality there. Exactly the same thing with Marillion. Marillion, very Genesis influenced, but could write songs, basically write love songs. You know, Kayleigh, that went to #1 as one of the biggest records of the 1980s, is a loved song to such an extent that me teaching in colleges for the last, 20 or 30 years, do you know how many Kayleighs I've come across? And I'm pretty sure that name didn't exist. Can you imagine Yes or Genesis inventing a girl's name, right? Palace, at the time when I was a youngster, I really liked Palace, because Palace were like very proggy, but also a little bit heavier. And they seem to have a little bit more of a foot in with the new wave of British heavy. I'm not saying they're a heavy metal band, but they just had that little bit of bite. Pendragon were much more like, say, a Camel, not the Animal. I know these guys, I know them, and so and it is hard for me to not crack jokes. And I know if they heard me cracking jokes, they would probably have a little smile to themselves, not the Animal, the band. Nick Barrett's such an incredible guitarist, one of the great guitarists of Neoprog, and there is a lot of sort of almost like Santana-esque guitar solos within Pendragon, very ethereal. So the style, I would say, is rooted in 70s prog, but has sort of an 80s pop sensibility. And we're not talking about pop music now. We're talking about the sort of British pop bands like Culture Club and Bronski Beats and Tears for Fears, who were writing quite heavy songs. So I think that legacy that emerged, right? I'm now going to talk about the legacy of Neoprog. So Marillion gets signed to a major label and they go stratospheric. And then all the other Neoprog bands, they're waiting around for their time, and eventually I think Palace gets signed next, and then I think around about 1987, and it's a little bit too late for IQ, they get signed for a major label. And IQ go down the route of going from doing these really dark, sidelong epics to going a lot more poppy. Now, I don't think they did that because they were signed. I think that was the way they were going. IQ had a couple of singles out. They went and supported Mike and the Mechanics. They had their videos on MTV. They had the whole works. And at the time, we had bands like It Bites emerging. It Bites are like another rogue band, They're almost like a teeny bop band. They had a big hit record called Calling All the Heroes, and then when you went and bought the album, it was full of full-on prog, an incredible band. And they'd come in a little bit after the Neo-Prog world era. And they're actually, if you go back into the 80s and then you start to look at bands like Nick Kershaw and you look at bands like Tears for Fears or Talk Talk, or even Kate Bush, or Peter Gabriel, we suddenly see that prog is just a big throbbing influence on British popular music. Right, I've argued this so many times before. Prog didn't go away, it just turned into pop music. And a lot of the big pop bands like Frank Goes to Hollywood, ABC, they're so close to being prog bands. You change the lyrical matter, right? That is about it. And they could be progressive rock bands. They're not progressive rock bands that sound like Yes and Genesis. But what Yes and Genesis did is there's far more of that in those bands than there is the Dead Kennedys or Sex Pistols, right? Anyway, a lot of these bands, I think because they gigged around, these small clubs for so long and they were so close to that original audience, when the limelight started to move away from them, they were able to consolidate that audience. And because a lot of these people had come up, they were, like I said, were business people, IT people, and they understood how businesses worked, they were able to turn these bands into little businesses themselves. And what actually happened then, once these prog bands in the 90s had set up their own labels, and they were often using, Kickstarter campaigns to get the fans to pay for what they were doing, not always, but Marillion did that. Once they got control of that, many of these neo-prog bands then turned in their masterpieces, By this time, when Marillion Fish had gone and was replaced by another singer, I think what's he called? H, they call him. You know, I am not a Marillion fan, as I've stated here before. But I think many people will point to these early '90s albums as being, you know, the real some of their greatest albums. And the band I do know, which is IQ, at that point they made, you know, a run of absolute prog masterpieces. Ever, which is incredible. They did the one with Wrong Side of Weird on. What's that one called? I was in this band. I'm now forgetting the bands that you know. They did. What did they do in the '90s? Subterranea, and whichever the album that it is. Is it called Wrong Side of Weird? That album. I played most of the tracks off it. You know, but this for me is you know, so many people will point to Subterranea as being, you know, IQ's real masterpiece. But I think, you know, these bands, by having the autonomy over what they do and not having to kowtow to the label, have been able to make the best albums of their career. So the quality's there, the fan base is there, and the bands that have kept going have been able to really keep that core audience and make it work. And I think this is, you know, such an interesting thing, that because they kept going and because there was that world there, especially here in the UK, it created like a little cottage prog industry, right? And that is basically what I ended up being a part of, if only on the fringe of it. And I know this channel, it starts off with its roots in that little British UK prog community. You know, all the people who buy tickets to Winter's End or Summer's End, the people who buy Prog magazine, the ones that are in all the forums and listen to all the radio shows, you know, all these people that have kept this scene going, right? And in that scene, musicians have been able to move in. It's not just been there just for the, you know, the old bands. You know, when I joined IQ, there was a thing in the UK called the Classic Rock Society, and it was wonderful. And it sort of looked after what they called classic rock, but it was predominantly prog. They had an awards show once a year, and they put on gigs. And they championed new bands, and new bands came into that scene. Bands like Big Big Train, who are now, you know, big enough to hit the charts all over the world, started off in that scene. It's always been a scene, right? So at the end of this video, I didn't think I would be championing Neoprog. I set out to, you know, poke some fun at this genre that I know very well, but actually it's an incredible thing, and it supports so many musicians, and it supports music that could not be made in anywhere else, including my own music. You know, I've got an album coming out this week which is called Fabella, and there's no way the normal music world can cope with this album I've made. It just does. It's not in any category, it's not in any style. It's full of avant-garde sections and long solos, and you know, it's conceptual and all this type of stuff. But I've been able to just grab my little place in the Neoprog firmament, and there's little radio shows that are interested in what I'm doing, and they want to interview me, and they're going to share what I do, and it's a fantastic thing, you know. So as much as I might not be a big fan of Marillion, right, and as much as I can probably tell you that all I've ever listened to is Script for a Jester's Tear and Misplaced Childhood, and I didn't like those particularly, but you know, I'm sure they've done some great stuff now. I've listened to it and, you know, I dipped my toe in. It sounds like dad rock to me. But what's wrong with dad rock? There's nothing wrong with dad rock, is it? We're all dads. I mean, I'm almost a granddad now. I'm definitely a step granddad. So it's a funny world that we live in, isn't it? I always end up saying this at the end of the video. It's just funny world we live in, isn't it? But Neoprog has given so much to the UK prog scene, and from there, the world's prog scene. And there's a whole network of people I know. A lot of them are watching this channel. So shall we just all, you know, raise our glass? I haven't got a glass. What have I got here that I can use as a glass? Nothing. I've got this pot. Oh, I tell you what I have got. I've got, very apt, I've got a pretend Christmas pudding from my Christmas video I did. So, shall we all raise a glass, or in my case, a faux Christmas pudding, to the wonderful genre that is Neoprog? Cheers! Oh, see, I should have finished then. but I haven't said my thing. I'll do that in a minute. So, if you like this video, like it. If you want to see more, then subscribe. If you want to know when the next video is coming out, ring the notification bell. If you want to support me, give me money, go to Patreon and you'll get a whole bunch of really brilliant content and you'll have loads of friends there because it's absolutely wonderful. But if you don't want to go to Patreon, you can put some money in the tip jar and I promise to not spend it on biscuits. I will spend it on the channel. So, thank you. And where was I? It was cool, wasn't it? I can't even do it now. I got my head just at the right hand. Was it that? No, it was the other way around. It was like that, wasn't it? And I just came up and I was going to just hit the button off because I'm not editing these videos this week. They're just going up raw. I thought, well, someone said, I like the old videos. I've got the old camera out and I've got no editing. I've come and switched the camera and I've gone and done it this week. If you like these more, I'm sure I'm better when it's like this. But my mouth does run. I'm sure I've said some things to upset people on the couple of videos done. Oh, I don't know. I'm now publicly regretting what I've done. I don't know. I'll have to go in. It's a modern world we live in. You know, it's like, oh, I don't know.